Welcome to Lecture 5, Environmentalist. 15 more to go, and we'll be done with this semester. Today, we're going to be learning about populations and urbanization, and it sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about this semester. So the first 4 lectures were kind of the building blocks to get to here. Populations and urbanization doesn't just apply to humans, but humans are by far ones that have overpopulated and urbanized the world. So we're going to take a look in depth at this issue. You'll see a lot of Waldo in this lecture series, and so see if you can find Waldo here or there. It's hard to find him in kind of that crowded population. That's the whole point, right? So here are learning objectives. We're going to discuss terms that are related to population, growth, and urban development. We will also evaluate problems with the population levels and discuss human demographics and statistics. Compare both birth rates and their trends. Assess problems with overpopulation and overconsumption. So overpopulation does create issues, and we're going to discuss what those are. Let's start by looking at the most typical face in the world. Kind of surprising about the typical face for now. That was the message of the video from National Geographic. So our introductory science servings, unfortunately this isn't the end, this is just the beginning. If you wanted to take a picture of 7 billion people standing shoulder to shoulder, we would all need to have just 500 square miles, about the size of Los Angeles, so we'd all be elbow to elbow. If the entire population were settled as densely as New York City, we could all fit into Texas. Texas is big. According to National Geographic, the most average person in the world is a 28-year-old Han Chinese male who speaks Mandarin and practices Christianity. 2.8 billion people live in extreme poverty. The poverty issue is something we will look at and how that affects the quality of life. Terms related to populations. Population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same geographic area at the same time. Now, we've had that term before already in our prior lectures. Population ecology, the study of populations and why their numbers change over time. That's a new one for us. When you look at all these people, what population do they make up? Is there too many of them in a geographic area? Why are they all in the same place? How do we manage the resources to take care of these people? Just think about the Super Bowl football game and how much resources were needed just to put that game on. Or the school that you go to. How do you manage to supply water and electricity, space, sewage, restrooms, you name it, for all of these people and manage it in a safe and effective manner? Especially when you're talking about density. So, demography, the applied branch of sociology that deals with population statistics and provides information on the population of various countries or groups of people. Demographics, however, is the application of population stats or statistics. So you notice at the end of the video, it showed you that the next most common average face will come out of India. India is currently the second most populated place in the world, and next to China. So that face will likely change in some of your lifetimes, and that will be a new looking person for the average person based on population. What is population density? The number of individuals or a species per unit area or volume at a given time. So you measure population, especially in cities, by population density, how many thousand people live per square mile, so forth. Environmental limits. This is the problem within a niche or an ecosystem that commonly involve food and water sources, which limit the growth of a local population. So if you have too many of something in an area trying to share the same resources, eventually there'll be too many to sustain, and then you'll have reached that ecological limit or threshold, and something has to give. More population terms. A carrying capacity is much the same as the last term we just learned about. It's the maximum number of individuals that an environment can support, noted by the letter K. Population crash is an abrupt decline in a population density. This is what happens when you exceed the ecological limit or threshold. The growth rate is the amount of species that are born per thousand per year, noted by the letter R. So we're interested in the letters K and R. What does this look like in terms of a mathematical equation? Well, we have population growth as the R equals B minus D, which is births minus deaths, plus I, which is immigrants, minus E, which is emigrants. So IM and EM mean two different things. One means in, one means out of a country. Then you divide that number by 1,000, and that gives you R, which is your population growth. So it's a very simple mathematical equation to determine population growth. Survivorship is another population term. This is the probability of a given individual in a population will survive to a specific or particular age. So when I was watching the video with you, if I was in Afghanistan, I would likely be dead because it said that the women lived to 45 on average. Well, I'm over that, so that was a little bit scary to think about living in Afghanistan. I much think I'd rather live in Japan, although I'm not sure I want to live to an average age of 86 either. Density dependence. A factor whose effect on population changes as population density changes. Remember, density is how many people are in a geographic area, like per square mile. Rainfall is required for livestock to have water to drink. This is an analogy. So we'll compare density dependence to density independence. That's a factor that impacts populations but is not influenced by changes in population density. It will either rain and fill up the stock tank or it won't, and the tank will dry up. Nevertheless, did the animals that needed to drink that water out of the stock tank live or die? So the livestock is dependent on having that tank or a source of water. The density of the cows, they may be reproducing, but if they run out of water, they're just out of luck, aren't they? So the density dependence and interdependence issue becomes important when you're considering how populations survive. There are 3 types of survivorship, type 1, 2, and 3. So let's examine them. Type 1, the young and those at reproductive age have a high probability of living. This would be something like humans and elephants. Elephants are very similar to humans. They have high cognitive abilities, by the way. Type 2, probability of survivorship does not change with age. For example, lizards, a mouse, a squirrel, they don't really have, their survival doesn't really have a life expectancy unless they're kept in captivity for a long range of time. I mean, they're likely to die any day based on what prey and circumstances are there. What's a type 3 population survivorship? The probability of death is greatest at a young age. Krill, the base of the food chain, fish, sea turtles. So hopefully you fall in a type 1, but not all organisms do, obviously. So current trends in population growth and development, what are they and what do they look like? So before current era, BCE, that's 10,000 years. I have issues with that because BCE, I don't know, geologically speaking, we have epochs and it should be from the Holocene epoch. So just saying, I just have some issues with that. But since we're talking population, we need to do it right. So before 10,000 years ago, there was about 1 million people estimated to be on the planet. 4,000 years ago, we reached the 7 million mark. 3,500 years ago, we reached the 10 million mark. 3,000 years ago, just 500 years later, we upped it to 14 million. 2,500 years ago, we reached 20 million. That's based on estimates of reproduction and the type 1 survivorship. When you're starting to look at the current era, that's from the last 1,000 years forward, we had in year 1, 200 million people on the planet. That seems like a lot, but it really wasn't. At 1800, we had 1 billion. At 1930, in just 130 years, we doubled by 1 billion people. So we're at 2 billion. In 1960, we reached 3 billion. In 1974, just 14 years later, we reached another billion. So this decade, the 60s and the 70s are notorious for having a high population growth. In 1987, I can remember the world was coming to an end. We were reaching 5 million people. How were we going to feed them, give them water? Oh, that's just incredible. It didn't take us but 13 years to get to 5 billion people from the last shot. But in 1999, you know, Prince's old song in 1999, man, it was going to happen. The world was going to pot because there was no way, even if computers turned over to the century correctly, that we'd be able to sustain a population of 6 billion people. But nevertheless, the world went on. In 2011, the world hit a 7 billion population mark. That began to raise red flags all over the place. Bad enough at the 6 billion, but when we're starting to talk about 7 billion, we're starting to talk about too many species of humans, or should I rephrase that and say number of people of humans. There's really only one species currently living. We'll have that discussion later in this semester. How are we going to feed them? How are we going to give them water, proper sewage, sanitation, all of those things? In 2024, it's estimated that we'll have 8 billion people. So that's 13 years. It takes us to up it to 8 billion. So you have to think about what's going to happen to the quality of life as we get 8 billion. And certainly in 2045, which most of you will be living at your adult life during that time, and maybe even thinking about retirement at that time, there'll be 9 billion people on the planet. It's not going to look the same as it does today in terms of economics, in terms of the quality of living. Something's going to give. There's just not enough resources to sustain that. So we look at the population growth rates, and you can see in the 60s and 70s, just what I said, there were huge numbers, 22% in the 60s and the 70s, 20%. In 1980, it was 18.5%. In 1990, it was 15.2%. In 2000, it was 12.6%. In 2010, it was 10.7%. In 2020, it's estimated to be at 6.8%. So, why has the growth rate literally slowed down since the baby boom? And that's an actual terminology, a term applied to this section of time, right in here, late 50s, early 60s, during the war, especially World War II time. So why has this happened? Why is the population growing at such a fast rate, but yet we have our lowest number of 10-year growth rates we've seen in decades? How is that possible? Well, we need to look at population characteristics, and then we start looking at fertility estimates as this process goes from 1950. And I want you to understand that the fertility rates are going to change if you start looking at the scale over here, and we'll let this cycle through twice so you can kind of see it. We have a much higher fertility rate. As it starts over, you can see the reds are 8 and over, and then it comes down to oranges 6.5 to 7, yellows are 5 all the way up to 6.5. Then you get into the blues, and they start going from 3.5 all the way to less than 1.5. And so we're going to see a trend or a change as we approach higher populations, because we're just not going to be able to sustain and have successful birth patterns with this many people. So is there a clean answer for how we fix this problem? Is there a morale answer to it? I mean, it's a struggle, and you need to think about that as we're talking about how population is changing. So what are generation names? The silent and greatest generation. My parents were a part of this generation. Like, my dad was born in 1927 and my mom was born in 1930. And so they definitely fell in the greatest generation. And they were called the silent because they basically didn't question things. They were pro-nation. They were supported. They were children during World War I, most of them, or their parents were actually. They were definitely subject to World War II. Then we get the baby boomers that happened in World War II, and that's where they produced, and they were born in 1944 to 1964. And then we get Generation X, which is 1965 to 1981. And of course, you can say people may be characteristic of more of one generation than another because they're closer or behave like that. So like, I'm a Gen X, but just barely. And so while I have Generation Y or millennial characteristics because I use computers and tech savvy, I also have traits for the baby boomers. So when you look at Generation Y, millennials, that's going to be most of you watching this, if not Generation Z. That's people born in 1975 to 1995. So my sister, for example, would qualify as a millennial. She was born in 1976. And very tech savvy. These people tend to be very good with any type of computerized gadget of sorts because they grew up with that in their life. Most of them don't even remember what it was like to have a landline or to not have cell phones or a computer. Generation Z, however, never knew what it was like to have life without a computer. So it's a whole new generation from 1992 to current. So these things matter, and resources matter to fulfill who's living in all of these generations. Demographic transition. As living conditions improve, a country enters successive phases of a process where the death rates fall. But there is a lag before the birth rate decline also, and this results in a temporary population soar or rise. Annual global growth is about 80 million people per year. It's a lot of births. Each new demographic phase is marked by redistribution of a population's age groups. What will it look like in 10 years from now, 15 or 50 years? U.S. population density in 2045 will likely be comparable to what we call present-day France. The global middle class will likely rise from about 400 million people in 2005 to slightly over 1 billion people in 2030. Most growth will occur in underdeveloped countries. We'll talk about that and why in a little bit. Fertility rate in Europe is currently 1.4%, putting it below the replacement rate. If not for immigrants, people coming into the country, to the United States, populations would likely be declining, similar to Europe. What are the impacts of large populations? Look at the pros and then the cons. We always try in science to look at both sides of the equation. The pros, large populations, large populations create more jobs because there are more people means more opportunity and needs more services. Certainly seen that since the development of the cell phone and tablets and computers and the things that we use in our everyday lives. Large populations also provide potential means for a strong work pool. However, the cons, if a population is too large, they can also be poor. They cannot pay for any of the services provided by others, and large populations require more resources such as water, sanitation, trash removal, food resources, and municipal infrastructures like piping to get water and sewage to and from a location. So there's some negative things to large populations. The quality of life also changes with population growth. Internationally, the quality of life is determined by the following factors: environmental degradation, health issues, urban deterioration, economic stagnation, persistent poverty, and hunger. These are all familiar things to us that we hear about in the news on a regular basis. So how do we deal with that? Because there becomes a moral issue, a human responsibility issue, and then there becomes the reality issue. And there's a tug of war between the three. Worldwide population trends may be a little bit surprising. 29% of the human population is under the age of 15, so they're teenagers. About 35% of the human population is under the age of 18. Again, teenagers. The average age of a human is 28. That makes me feel really old. Probably makes you feel like, I'm getting to my prime. Europe averages the oldest humans. Africa averages the youngest humans. Why is that? So when you look at the world average and then you see Africa average right here and then you see Europe over here, numbers of people under the age of 15, why is this so high and that so low? That's something to ponder, to consider. That goes to this topic right here, underdeveloped countries versus developed countries. So in no way am I saying and putting a paradigm or a stamp on underdeveloped countries that they're all the same, or that, for example, like we'll be talking about in Africa, that every place in Africa fits this scenario. It's just not true. So we need to be careful about the discussion here, because understand we're looking at it from an objective lens, not from a feeling of, well, this is my country, it's not that way. You know, if you're from one of these countries, what it's like better than any of us who are not. And so never underestimate that an underdeveloped country may be one of the most powerful developed countries in the future. And so as we look at these, keep that in mind. In underdeveloped countries right now, there's a younger marrying age, They have much larger families. Women are considered successful if they can bear and produce many children that add to working for their families. Family sizes are also rooted in culture. It's like part of the culture to have large families. They represent 95% of the future population growth. That is a staggering percentage, 95%. And this is what the United States was back in 1800. So I wanted to use that as an example to show you that it's not always some of the countries that are profiled on TV right now. The United States is a powerhouse at this time. Doesn't mean we will be 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years down the road. It all is going to be based on that population. So what's a developed country characteristic look like in population? They have older marrying ages, typically smaller families. Women are considered successful when they make money. That means they're employed and they're wealthy. Population levels are likely to decline by the year 2050. Developed countries experience a replacement fertility rate of 2.1%. That's the United States starting in 2000. So what will we look like in 2050? That's a good question. Population characteristics. So let's look at women with high educations typically have fewer children. Why do you think that is? So I'm like that example. I have 2 stepchildren. I have no biological children, partly my choice, partly nature's choice. But nevertheless, I have a lot of education. Like I'm on 3/4 of the way through my doctorate program. So does that mean I studied not to have children? Not at all. My time was spent in a career. It was spent in developing education. And I didn't have the time to do that. I didn't feel like I needed to raise children and not be able to give 100% of my time to them. Women in U.S. average 2 children. That's certainly what situation for me. I was in a family of 2 children. Women in India average 2.6 children. You're going, how can you have a point something children? That's an average. So many of them have 5, 6, 7, 8 children. Why is this the case? So when you start looking at the amount of education, one could concur or conclude that the more education you have, especially if you're a graduate or a professional degree, a terminal degree like a doctorate, that you would probably have less children if you were female. And the data supports that scientifically across the world. Fertility rates around the world. This one just really is an interesting set of data for me. Let's start by looking at Canada, 1.6%. The United States is at 1.9%. Let's look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, 6.0%. Look at Japan, little bitty, 1.4%. South Korea, 1.2%. Come on and scroll down to Chad at 6.2%. The United Kingdom, 1.8%. Italy, 1.4%. But I put the highest and the lowest in yellow and compare where they're located. And then think about what happens in those countries, education levels, so forth, and population. And it matters, right? So fertility rates do vary around the world. Contraceptives and development. Contraceptives are often used almost exclusively in developed and developing countries more than underdeveloped countries. This remains controversial today because of ethical reasons associated commonly with religion and morality. In some places in India, the government will pay a man's week's wage, which is about $25, to receive a vasectomy. In some places in underdeveloped countries, sterilization camps have sprung up in rural areas to provide free or even cheap vasectomies or tubal ties, so they don't have to keep having more children and can't sustain the resources that they have. So when you look at that and you see this, it is a staggering statistic and a set of numbers worthy of discussion. The China one-child policy kind of gotten a bad rap, but I'd like to talk about it with a different lens. In China, citizens were legally allowed to have 1 child between 1978 and 2015. That has since been changed. The penalty for having an additional child was 200 yuan, which was $31,250. Not too far off from what it costs for adoption, if not more, in the United States. Estimated to have prevented between 250 to 400 million births in China. In China, which is also the most populated country in the world, the current fertility rate is very low at 1.5%. There is a penalty still in place for single mothers, and also the fine for excess children is called a social maintenance fee. That may seem so foreign to those of us who were born in the United States, but that's what they choose to call it. So you may or may not believe in birth control, but this is something that is being looked at in highly populated areas of the world for a reason. The Brazilian population shift, a fascinating case study. In Brazil, the population declined rapidly following the development of electricity. With electricity came the introduction of television. Everybody's favorite evening shows and programs. You know what that's like at your house. It's believed by many demographers that the population of Brazil began to decline when people saw small families on television. They had less time for other things, and because of the rise in female education, more children were just not being born. We had started seeing a lower birth rate. Today, the fertility rate is 1.8 as compared to 4.3 in 1980. That's a remarkable change in less than 30 years. So that is a really interesting case study of showing you how lifestyle and commodities and amenities change a country and its birth rate. Human demographics and economics. When you think about demographics, it often entails or often details the type of country being studied. That is so true. The higher age averages typically demonstrate the level of industrial and development in that particular country. So when we take a look at the green line here, we're looking at, here's your death rate, there's your birth rate, your size of population, and then you're looking at the number of births and deaths, and the population from pre-industrial to transitional to industrial and then post-industrial. And I want you to notice what happens here as your population starts to decline. So post-industrial is where the United States is headed. In the pre-industrial stage, the birth rates and death rates are high. Modest population growth is experienced in the pre-industrial stage. When you get into that transition stage from pre-industrial to industrial, you see a lower death rate and rapid population growth. So let's apply that to the United States, 1960s and 1970s. In the industrial stage, birth rates decline and population growth slows. Well, we saw that in the numbers for the United States. When you started looking in the 2000s and started looking beyond the current time. So the birth rates decline, population growth slow. And post-industrial stage, low birth and death rates and population growth is very slow. When you look at population pyramids, let's look at Kenya, the United States, and Germany. And one thing I want to point out for United States and Germany is let's look at females on both sides and then males. And you can see there's over the years from 1915 to 1919, then you start coming down and you see some spikes in different years. You can correlate that to historical events. And then you look at 1990 to 1994, which is the most recent data on this. And then you can look at the ages. You begin to see a trend. But you come over here to Kenya, take a look at this. You see in the age of population, most of it exists below 25 to 29, and then you have very little that's up at 75 and 79. So we have a moderate size elderly population, and then we have in Germany a much larger elderly population. But look at this row right here. It's not too far off from what the percent is of birth rate. The point is that it really matters when you're talking about demographics to look at the country, because the country is going to dictate what these bars look like. Over half of the world's population lives in urban environments. I'm a native Houstonian. I don't live there now. And I would choose not to. If you're moving to Houston, I would caution you to any big city that you'll likely endure traffic for the rest of your life. There's some payoffs for that with higher paying jobs, some cool stuff, lots of urban benefits. Urban areas are often determined by a type of job, not necessarily population density. I would argue that by saying traffic is an indicator of density. Characteristics of an average global urbanite would be female, young and single, above average education for their region, an entry-level, low-middle class vocation, and commercially based, not industrial. Regardless, many of you will end up working in urban environments. And if you do, the urban life has a lot to offer, but there's some drawbacks. And resources is one of them. Are there going to be enough resources for all the people living in urbanized areas? The total world gross domestic product, GDP, went from 29.8 trillion in 1980 to 72.5 trillion in 2009. Wow, that's a big, big change in just less than 30 years. China's GDP grew 1,506% during that time. Japan's grew 74%. Africa's grew 151%. I think you should keep a close eye on Africa. There's a lot coming down the forefront about what their contribution of developed country status might be in the next 20 years. Europe's GDP grew 75% of that time, and the United States grew 119%. Urbanization. The dust dome, a dome of heated air that surrounds an urban area containing substantial air pollution. Oh, I forgot to mention that's one of the drawbacks of living in Houston, Texas. Not always a smog cloud, but also can be a smog cloud. And if you don't know what smog is, it is a chemical reaction between volatile organic compounds and NOx gases, which is nitrous oxides. I used to work for Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and Houston, Texas, of course, is a non-attainment area for air quality, meaning they don't meet the Federal Clean Air Act. Most big cities around the United States qualify for that. It's not just in Texas, it's all of the states. Compact development, the design of cities in which tall, multiple unit residential buildings are close to shopping locations and jobs, and all are connected by public transportation. I think about Houston again, and there's not a railway system yet, but somewhere down the line that's going to have to be introduced. And even if you think about Texas, getting from Houston to Dallas, there's a new proposition of building a fast railway to get from city to city in a very short amount of time, like we would see in some of the other mega urbanized areas around the United States. So what is a mega city? Cities with more than 10 million inhabitants. That's a lot of people. I just had a student graduate from Texas A&M who's been in my classes and gone on field course multiple times. And he got an architectural degree. Originally started in geology, shifted over to architecture, and now he's going to get a master's in land use planning. Very smart for him, because this is going to be an important element down the line. This is the process of deciding the best uses for underdeveloped land in a given area and assist in preventing fractured development. Urban land is regulated by or via zoning into three major types. So you basically can't build in these zones unless you're that kind of type. So if it's commercial zoning, you can't put a house there. If it's residential, you can't put a commercial there, like an operation or a strip mall. If it's industrial, you can't put commercial or residential there. So there's zoning laws that make it to where a city is more well organized in terms of how resources are allocated. Urban agglomeration. These are urbanized core regions that consist of several adjacent cities and their surrounding developed suburbia areas. Sometimes these areas are referred to as tunnel towns. Kind of a cool thing to know. Brownfields are interesting to me because when I worked at TCEQ, we helped fund brownfields, and some very popular places are brownfields, and we'll talk about them. These are properties that may have been contaminated from pollution and get cleaned up and used for beneficial use for a community. A sustainable city is defined as a city with a livable environment, a strong economy, and social and cultural sense of community. Sustainable cities enhance the well-being of current and future generations of urbanized dwellers. Suburban sprawl. This is a patchwork of vacant and developed tracts around the edges of city and contain low population density. But as cities grow outward, and I think of Austin, Texas, for example, there used to be a big gap between Austin and Georgetown, and like a 30-minute gap in driving time on I-35, and now it's just one seamless flow. And it's amazing that that suburban sprawl has filled up to be just one giant packed out, just for miles that you can see, of city dwellings, of residential, commercial, and industrial areas. Urbanized heat island, what is that? That forms around a downtown area when artificial surfaces like asphalt, which are dark, trap excess heat and also create dust domes from pollution. Long commutes create a large presence of airborne emissions like volatile organic compounds, NOx gases, particulate matter. Overdependence on natural resources to build infrastructures occur, and populations grow from immigration rather than from births. So when you're starting to look at temperatures, you can begin to see the highly dense areas. That's just a map showing lights at the top, and then at the bottom showing you the actual temperature or surface temperature of the ground. And there is a correlation from urbanized, heavily urbanized areas having hotter ground surfaces than the areas that would be like urban sprawl. Making cities more sustainable. There are ways to do this. To make urban environments more sustainable, many people grow gardens along building facades or on rooftops to try to help in providing more opportunities to improve air emissions and air quality, as well as produce crops. On one recent study published in National Geographic determined that dense cities tend to emit less CO2 per capita than the national average when these cities are putting in these sustainable efforts. The study determined that the most crucial factors to where a city's sources of energy and the effectiveness of the city's public transportation system. So people that live in like New York have a rail system. Well, you look at Houston, Texas, they don't have that. Houston is really struggling with air quality, while New York does as well. They also have a public transportation system. And in some places in the world, public transportation replaces the need for a car. And so that helps reduce emissions. As the human population grows, so does the need for additional agricultural lands, housing, transportation, and other basic resources, like water. In many places, like Texas, viable croplands are being covered with houses, businesses, and roadways. What does that mean to us when we have 8 billion people and not enough food to feed them? At present in the United States, about 1 acre, which is 0.4 hectares of land per capita, is covered with some form of urbanization or highway. In 1960, the U.S. had about half an acre per capita, roughly half of what it is today. So it's remarkably changed in 50 years. Why does all this matter? Unchecked population and unchecked consumption rates lead straight to famine. That's where we're headed. The next half century is going to be a cause of radical alterations in determining what is acceptable for creating energy and securing resources. It's part of the political realm in the White House right now, and it will continue to be for each presidency that comes through. But it's not just going to be for the United States, it's going to be globally. Global economics will become more prevalent than ever before. Asia will become an economic giant. Europe will be more of an afterthought, and the United States will remain somewhere in between. So consider that when you're thinking about where you want to work, your opportunities. Invest wisely, because you're going to want to make sure you live in a place that has enough resources. So how does this relate to environmental science? That leads us to our science servings. It is estimated that a child born today in the United States will live to be 120. It is estimated that a child born today will spend 1/3 of his or her life looking at a screen like you are right now watching this lecture. Today, the most sought after female models are typically Eurasian. 20 years ago, they were Swedish. In 10 years, the most prevalent human being in the world will likely be a 23-year-old India man. In 1952, the life expectancy was 38 in India. Today, it's 68, almost double. That's just incredible. In 1952, life expectancy was 41 in China, and today it's 71. Even more incredible. Close to 1 billion people go hungry every day, and that is depressing. But that is a reality, and it's becoming and will be a more of reality as we approach the 8 billion and 9 billion number of total population in the world. For each surname in the United States, there are 350 people on average. In China, there are 174,696 people. 150,000 people are born each day, and according to the Pew Research Center, white and Hispanic populations are the most likely to intermarry. Black and white females are the least likely to marry Asian men. So, with there being so many people in the world, what about other species? We're going to talk about people. What about the other things? 1.7 million camels. By the way, camels are indigenous to the United States, if you didn't know that. 293 million cows. 518 million sheep, I believe that. Just in Iceland alone, there's millions of sheep. 633 million turkeys. 1.3 billion pigs, 2.6 billion ducks, 52 billion chickens. I'm a big chicken eater. That's a lot of chickies. That's a lot of chickens. Good grief. That's a lot to take on. 19% of the world, or people in the world, are Chinese, and 17% of all people in the world are Indian. 4% of all people in the world are American. So we're in the minority now. You are considered high income for a global level if you make more than $12,196 annually. 13% of all people in the world speak Mandarin as their first language, not English. 5% of the people in the world speak either Spanish or English as their first language. 82% of people in the world are literate. That's an impressive number right there. So when you look at the chromosome lineup, you can actually, this is from 23andMe, and this is Brad's, 2.8% Neanderthal. I'm 3% Neanderthal. The most you could ever be is 5% Neanderthal. And we show this to you because Brad and I are almost all European descent, even though we're not related. But when we did our 23andMe's, we came back as highly European. I had a really odd thing put in mine, like a 0.0 some odd percent of sub-Saharan. When he saw that, he's like, that's really cool because you have some interesting heritage in your background. So as we conclude for the day, individuality, always remember that you are unique just like everyone else. Population is changing. How does that affect you in your future life? I will see you in lecture 6. Looking forward to seeing you there. Have a great day. Bye.